recorded that before, though.
It's okay, because of quantum entanglement, the students who aren't here tonight will leave with that knowledge.
Well, and it's not actually mine. I'm just trying to represent what Stuart Hameroff talks about very, very beautifully. 'Cause he's working in the medical field, he is, as an anesthesiologist, he has put thousands of people under sedation and monitored them through the surgeries and then brought them out. And as a result, he's had lots of experiences with various states of consciousness and has learned that people, while they're unconscious and clearly not physically aware of what's going on around them, nonetheless are going to perceive lots of what's happening generally from above. Which, I mean, there's lots of records of people doing precisely that. They've seen the surgeons usually watching the whole operation from above, and so on. And so his explanation is that there's like a cloud, a neural quantum cloud around us. And that's pretty traditional too. If you remember the pictures of saints and Jesus and others in the Middle Ages, they have the halo depicted around them. And if you wonder where did that come from, that they were trying to paint the soul, basically, arguing that the soul being perfect, or the most perfect part of us, would be round, and not round as in a circle, but round as in a globe. But of course their painting techniques did not give them the ability to show it like a fish tank over your head, but instead just as a flat circle behind with various colors. And by the way, there are still people today who have synesthesia that can actually see your aura and see colors around you depending on your mood. You might be one, actually. For some reason, people with synesthesia tend to be hesitant to point out that they can see those colors and things to other people because people think they're weird and they've learned to not mention it. My daughter is one of those. My wife is scary, actually. When we went to the symphony, for example, the one time she said, "That violinist is gray." I looked at him and he looked perfectly fine to me. And she said, "Well, no, he's gray. That's his color." And I said, "What does that mean?" And she says, "Well, whenever I've seen someone that's gray, they die soon afterwards." And he was dead by the next symphony. So that was pretty, you feel the hair going up. I always worry when she looks at me what color she sees. So when, obviously they had people that could see those colors, the auras, the heat. We now have cameras that do it. So, it's just, most people don't have the ability to see those kinds of heat auras or whatever. But now that we have cameras, you can have visual proof that you can see the heat if you have the right ability, I suppose. Obviously, there were people back then that had that ability, and so they, in the art, it's clearly reflecting what people believed to be the soul. But it's, and as, trying to remember who I'm quoting now, I think it's Aquinas, talks about the soul, how big is the soul, right? I shouldn't just use my mind, I should pull up the source, right? Because it's right there. So, soul. How specific should I be? Is the soul a body? Are the souls of brute animals subsistent? Might want to go, but, so you can see he answers practically all the questions you can think of with regard to what the soul is. And of course, this is what, 1285 or thereabouts. So we must premise that the soul is defined as the first principle of life of those things which live. Can't really argue with that. That's energy, of course. So it's animate, which means it moves. It means anima is Latin for soul. So it just means you move, basically. And those things which have no life inanimate, obviously. Now life is shown principally by two actions, knowledge and movement. That's an important thing. Wasn't it Alistair McGrath talking about the nature of the soul? I think it was him, or it might be Hammeroff, that it's not just having the energy and essentially being alive, but it's also having information, knowledge, right? We wouldn't be I think he says the sun, a star, is energy, but we don't think of that as consciousness. Because for consciousness, for the soul, we want also information. It has to have life, but also be aware, right, of things. So, well, I don't want to get, this is obviously a big topic, but we can just go on and discuss 2 or 3 weeks worth at least, and just be more confused afterwards. But tonight, we want, so basically, when I ask the question, do we have a soul, I don't think there's a requirement for you also to believe in God or not. It's not necessarily suggesting that you have to be a member of a religious community in order to think that there are such a thing as a soul. So when I ask the question, I ask, given the nature of science today, does science mean that there can't be such a thing as a soul? In fact, all my thinking about what a soul might be comes really from what I read in science. I don't think there's a conflict. But I want to introduce pragmatism tonight. We've talked about that, how to spell it, etc. I should use my own notes, I suppose. I have lots of notes. It's easier to use those. Let's see, instead of, let's go through my notes. Which notes are they? There you go. So, lecture 14 on this system. So, can you see that? Was that too small? Make it bigger. So this is a quote from a book by Louis Menand. Should I show you that too? And it's called The Metaphysical Club. And that's what they called themselves. That was an actual club at Harvard called the Metaphysical Club. And so you get a group of individuals, including Charles Sanders Peirce. Have I mentioned him before?
You mentioned the club before, so probably.
I mentioned the club before too. Okay, so Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, brother of Henry. I guess everybody's familiar with Henry James. I remember my Russian teacher in the Defense Language Institute, and I asked her who was her favorite American author, she said, "Oh, Henry James." And I thought, how Russian can you get? You know, that's as Dostoevsky as I can think of any American author. But Henry James. John Dewey, who will also be looking at the second part of tonight. How many folks are familiar with John Dewey? Just one?
Sounds familiar.
But these are like our homegrown American philosophers. So these are good ones as Americans for us to be familiar with. And this is our philosophy, pragmatism. We might call it neo-pragmatism, because we get bored calling it the same thing. So if we reiterate it, we call it neo. And it's not just because that's the main character in the Matrix. It's, right, that's, okay. And by the way, I have as an example, a contemporary example, I have Cornel West, and I think he's just absolutely amazing. If you had a chance to watch the video that I have linked right here, if you've had a chance. I was watching that just before some others came in. Tonight, I also have a link to the video Greece or Rome, and one of the quiz questions will be, which do you think has had the most impact on the United States, Greece or Rome? In a way, it's kind of a joke, because obviously both have had a tremendous impact on us. So who do you think has had the most impact on us, Greece or Rome? And by the way, if you've watched the debate, you'll notice that
we live in strange times.
But so you have Mary Beard, who's the one person arguing for Rome, and then you have Boris Johnson, who's the other, who's the current Prime Minister of England. England? Great Britain? What do they call themselves? The UK? Whatever. Because it's the whole thing, not just, I don't know what they call themselves.
Everything but Southern Ireland.
Yes. So that's pretty cool. So it's fun. That's one of the reasons I like him, by the way. I've got bunches of his books. He's fascinating. Mary Beard is absolutely fascinating too. They're just absolutely cool. And plus they sound British. They have a British accent, which is, actually, he's from New York. So why he doesn't sound like he's from New York, I don't know. He didn't live there long enough, I guess, but he's American as well as British, double citizenship. Yeah, pretty cool. Really, I was thinking, hey, why doesn't he run for president here? That would have been cool, but I would have voted for him. However, as it was, I voted for Hillary. Jeez, what can I say? However.
So how does the debate turn out?
Oh, well, you get to watch it and choose.
And choose.
It's well worth listening to if you haven't had a chance. And notice it's not a book, so I'm not assigning a reading. I'm assigning you don't have to read it. You can just listen. Right. Okay. But so this is from Louis Menand, the Metaphysical Club, which notice has one. Where's the sticker? My book has a sticker on it that says that it's won a Pulitzer Prize. Isn't it not say? It doesn't say. But there should be a great big, you know how they put big seals, you know, yes, I won the prize, you should read me. But so that's pretty cool. But so during the late 19th century, have I already read this in this class? No. So during the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there was an outburst and flourishing of philosophic activity in America. The key figures drew upon a variety of European orientations. British empiricism, Kant, Hegel. Notice that's comma Kant, comma Hegel, so he's not associating either of those with British empiricism. But an important group emerged which included Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, John Dewey, and George Herbert Mead, and there's others. In the book he also talks about just the Supreme Court Justice, not Sherlock Holmes, but the other Holmes, whatever Holmes's name was, I can't think of. Junior, something Holmes, whatever. Okay, but although there were sharp differences in their intellectual backgrounds, philosophic temperaments, training and interests, nevertheless, there were also sufficient family resemblances, which is a phrase that comes from Wittgenstein, so that they, as well as others, began to think of themselves as constituting a distinctive philosophic movement. William James, a gifted stylist and an immensely popular lecturer, because they didn't have radio, they didn't have TV. You could go to so many concerts, but what a lot of townsfolk would do is they would go to lectures at the local theaters. So these speakers would go around. William James was one. Josiah Royce was another very popular lecturer. Etc. So they labeled the movement pragmatism and acknowledged Peirce as its founder. Sometimes it is said that pragmatism was born from Jace's misunderstanding of Peirce. And Peirce was so outraged, and that's kind of wrong. I mean, James helped feed Peirce for years, so his Peirce was bankrupt and Peirce lent him money. Was so outraged by James' popularization that he renamed his own doctrine pragmaticism, a name ugly enough to be safe from kidnappers. So, pragmatism, if we try to trace that, the Greek word pragma means that which has been done. And it's similar to the Latin word res, which means thing. You hear that in law a lot. We also heard it in Descartes, the res cogitans, the thinking thing. Kant already used the word as in relation to some definite human purpose. And his very first book was a pragmatic anthropology. So Kant used the word already. Peirce, however, uses it to refer to how knowledge is related to human action. So it's a very practical application to it. And by the way, that aspect of it that Peirce gives it is referred to today as the semiotic, the theory of the semiotic, or semantics, which is the theory of meaning, right? And so there are journals on the semiotic, or semiotica, and what people try to do are make those connections between the sounds we make and the actions that we perform. So it's a very clear science. I mean, there's very strict ways of approaching it. You record the sounds that are being uttered, and you also record what actions are being taken, and you can actually come up then with a very amazing, boring, but detailed description of what the meaning of certain utterances are, including all sorts of nuances to it, which, by the way, of course, is really important today when we're looking at how language can be used by devices and by artificial intelligence that also use language. Just driving around, you have a device telling you where to go, probably, right? If you don't know where you're going, you turn on your GPS, and the nice lady in your car tells you to turn left here, and if you don't turn that way, she's very polite, notice, and she waits a little while, and she says, if you get the chance, please make a U-turn, that she's very nice about, she's not gonna say, you idiot, you passed the road. You know how that goes. So a lot of that has grown out of Peirce. Peirce is, well, we'll talk more about Peirce. So his philosophy is that the foundation of the philosophy is a behavioral semiotic. And semiotic is a theory of signs. A word's meaning is its use. Meaning, logic, rhetoric. Now keep in mind that if we look at what was going on in continental Europe, Kant gave us that revolution that says, the reason that the world looks the way it does to us is because of the way humans look at it. We have a filter, right? And he thought it was universal, he was wrong. But then when you go to Hegel and his contemporaries, you have kind of a sociological aspect to all of that. And you realize that the filter comes from your language and your culture and your values, all of which is a social thing. So reason is a social thing, right? And so for Hegel, the spirit is the energy that enables sounds and knowledge to occur, right? So that's where that all goes. Well, if you take that and follow it in a very logical sequence, you realize that means we have to try to study language and understand how language develops and how meaning occurs. So this is really a very logical sequence going from what the Europeans were trying to do, to understand the nature of reality, we have to understand the nature of language. It's also referred to as the linguistic turn. I was trying to think, and I also, didn't I already talk about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis? We talked about that much earlier, how significant your culture, your language is to the way you perceive the world. So you can see that this is all interconnected that way, right? Okay, so the pragmatic maxim, meaning is the connection between action and experience. And I notice for Peirce, we build up from meaning, then to logic, and then to rhetoric. So that's actually the same as the old tradition in the Middle Ages at the university, where you would go and you'd get the quadrivium and the trivium, the different, yes, did we talk about that at all? Remember trivium? Trivium are 3 subjects. 3, right? Quadrivium are 4, right? So if we look at what they are, Hillsdale. I don't want this. Let's go to all right, so 4 subjects. And what 4 are they? Arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So the 4 subjects that were called the quadrivium, right? Arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And I should actually have done the trivium first. you'll see the organization of these subjects, because it starts off here, notice, instead of meaning, as Peirce refers to it, here we have grammar, right? And if you think about it, that's the way our educations used to start. In grammar school, beginnings, right, you get how you structure your language correctly, so you can speak like an educated person, right? Then you learn logic, which is how you structure an argument, which would basically be 3 statements, right? Make sure you get your statements grammatically correct, but then you have 3 statements, and now you have logical arguments. And then you move on to speeches, which are connections of arguments, so that's rhetoric, right? So you start off small, get bigger, and then once you're done the trivium, then you move to the quadrivium, which is your arithmetic, your geometry. Why is music there? Why do you think music would be there? Does that seem like a odd sort of connection? You know, when you go to school, you don't get arithmetic, then geometry, and then music.
Patterns and relationships.
Yeah, and the medievals were thinking that there's music of the spheres, the choirs of angels. The angels were the planets. They're the planet pushers, the messengers. They're in between God. God's up there. So the angels, the messengers, and the messengers move the spheres. And the belief was that while they were doing that, they would obviously be making sound. Because if you move something in the air locally, it makes a sound. So the assumption was that yes, those planets make sounds, and they must be perfect. So the angels, we have various levels, right, for various planets. You have choirs of angels making music, yes? And of course there's an attempt to kind of, I played some music. We were trying to think of meditative states last week, right? In the Sainte-Chapelle, right? I just picked that one for no reason, especially, right? Just the idea of the verticality of the glass and the verticality of the music is it's a medieval attempt to kind of imitate what they believed would be perfect music. It's not supposed to be sexy, by the way, right? Because that would accomplish just the opposite of what it should do. So music, and then astronomy, right? So basically the course curriculums are set up to move up, from the bottom up. And oddly, Peirce shows he's aware of that, of course, by just following the tradition. It changes it somewhat, because instead of grammar, it's more meaning is more important. Okay, so Peirce was born in 1839, died in 1914. Born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, his father Benjamin was a leading mathematician and astronomer at Harvard. He graduated from Harvard in 1859, then went to the Lawrence Scientific School and graduated with his degree in chemistry in 1863, and that's summa cum laude. For the next 15 years, he did 3 things at once. He was an astronomer at Harvard measuring light. He was a physicist for the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, working for his father, who was the head of that. And that was primarily with regard to mapping the area around Washington, D.C. because of the Civil War. So they were on the side of the North, obviously, mapping the area for defensive purposes. And he was also engaged in his own private philosophical studies. Then in 1879, he became a lecturer at the new Johns Hopkins University, which I just learned tonight re-listening to Cornell West's lecture, and he mentioned that one of the lecturers at the Hopkins University was a Hopkins who actually was a descendant of Schopenhauer. Now, it couldn't have been directly Schopenhauer. It had to be sister or something, because remember, Schopenhauer only loved a dog, his
Don't
poodle.
forget the poodle.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but so that's kind of interesting. I have to look him up. So I guess that's how the university got its name, even. Interesting. But so Peirce is a lecturer in logic at Johns Hopkins University. And by the way, that will connect with Dewey, because Dewey, after he gets his BA at the University of Vermont, he goes to Johns Hopkins for philosophy and doesn't actually take Peirce's course, but he attends some of his lectures. So he meets Peirce there. So if you're looking for a physical person-to-person connection between all those who become pragmatists with Peirce, the founder of it, Dewey does have that connection. Now, why did he retire and go back to Milford, PA? His house, by the way, is a museum. I don't know if I showed it to you, but you could go and visit Arisby. It's a museum, so you can go and visit. Pardon?
Cool.
So you can go visit his house. It's about a mile from the Walmart, so used to be in the, but now there's a Walmart there. So.
It looks huge.
I guess for the time, maybe. I remember he was broke. And why was he broke? Because he dated a French woman. So he's a professor at Johns Hopkins. And he dated a woman who was French and still married,
Was he aware?
I'm sure.
Oh,
But was he aware that that was going to get him fired because of, you're dating a married woman? You know, that was just, ugh.
yeah, that's what I
So
was
not
thinking.
only was he fired, but that's going to make sure no one will ever hire you again. That's the evilness of that kind of thing. He did, by the way, she did get a divorce from her husband, who was in France, I guess.
That's
She
why I
ended
wondered
up
if he
marrying
just didn't
him
know, maybe.
and lived with him. Pardon?
I just wondered if he didn't know of her marriage, but if he
I'm,
knew, then that's.
no, I'm sure he knew.
So he was fired because he was dating her, and he was broke because he was jobless.
Right.
That's the series causality.
That's a woman.
I was like, because at first it was like he dated.
Oh, he
a
wasn't
French
broke
woman,
until
so
he
obviously
got
was
fired.
broke.
Broke and she
And-
was French.
That's right. That's what the first connection. I mean, it's like I'm missing
That
something.
could be. Le Champagne is très, well, I don't know why the first word comes toyer.
Yeah, so
So, I'm confused. Okay. So, he ended up basically just living in his house with his wife, and he died before her, so I'm hoping she had some sort of income, one way or the other. And both of them lived longer than James, and James was the source of their financial help. So I don't know what helped them once James died. So that's kind of interesting, I suppose. All right. And they were both, James and Peirce were both members of the Metaphysical Club while they were at Harvard. And Dewey met him at Hopkins. So switch over to William James. But by the way, there's lots of writings by Charles Sanders Peirce. There's a Peirce Society in the United States. There's an American Charles Sanders Peirce Society that you can, I guess you pay dues if you join. But they have all of his writings, I think, on the web, so you could look them up. So, and some of his articles are pretty famous. How to Think Clearly, for example, and so on. But James is the more famous. And yet he was not so much a philosopher initially as a psychologist. Although at the time, psychology and philosophy were really kind of closely knitted together. And he moved out of psychology, although I haven't read it, but his book, The Fundamentals of Psychology, is considered to be the basic primer on pragmatism. And yet it's a book about psychology. And the odd thing is that electricity has been invented and tamed somewhat. They have machines, of course. And James applied electrical current to the brain and argued that it is electrical, basically. And I know part of his experimentation included zapping people with electricity. It came to be used as a therapy. Yes, you've heard of that, using electrical current to zap people. And he was convinced that if you zap people with electricity, their personalities change. So it must be electrical. Right? So that's kind of intriguing. So what are what's considered to be the unproblematic, the things that they didn't argue with one another about, and that is the prestige of science and the scientific method. They all agreed that science is whoop-de-doo. Strength of empiricism, seeing is believing, that kind of thing. Biological evolution, and that's pretty interesting because one of their teachers at Harvard was a biologist who was absolutely convinced that evolution was false, and that was I'll think of it. His name, Agassiz, Louis Agassiz. Was actually from Switzerland initially. One of the buildings on Harvard, the one that has the anthropological museum with all the, is it anthropological, or it's got all the bones, the dinosaur bones, and so it's not just anthropological, but it's got to be natural history, I guess, is named in his honor. But he also took students on trips to Brazil, including William James. He went to Brazil on a trip and got sick while he was there, and almost died, spent 2 years ill at home, thought he was going to die. But he did recover and ended up going to Harvard to teach, so didn't lose William James. It's interesting, it wasn't with him as far as I know, but Teddy Roosevelt, when he graduated from Harvard, he went to Brazil as well, and it's also interesting that he ended up ill from his trip. So it's like the Harvard thing, you graduate, you go to Brazil, and you die. You know, I don't know if they all would die, but it's like the graduation trip, go visit Brazil. the Amazon. Agassiz was trying to prove that if there was an ice age, that it was in Brazil too. It was all over. For some reason, he thought that, you know, if God had created an ice age, he wouldn't have just had it like in different places. He would have had like the whole world under ice. And so he was trying to demonstrate that there was glaciers in the Amazon as well. And he thought he'd proved it, which actually, of course, he didn't. And James was with him on that trip and was pretty convinced that they hadn't demonstrated that, so it's kind of interesting. So all the pragmatists are accepting of biological evolution, even though Agassiz was against it. Ideals, they also were definitely American democracy. That was all shared value for them. Peirce was a scientist, mathematician, logician. James was a psychologist. Mead, who I won't discuss much at all, was a sociologist. And John Dewey was an educator. And Oliver Wendell Holmes was the Supreme Court justice, who was, by the way, considered to be the first activist justice by someone I read, and I can't remember who it was. Oh, no, it was the lecturer we had a couple months ago, who argued that he was the first activist justice. Okay, so Peirce also called it pragmaticism, and Dewey, who was a pragmatist, but he called his philosophy instrumentalism because knowledge is an instrument. So William James was born in New York City. His father, Henry James Sr., was a theologian, Swedenborgian, also known as New Jerusalem Church. Ever heard of it? New Jerusalem, Swedenborgian? Not any. This is actually pretty cool. So Swedenborg, guess where he was from? Sweden. What do we guess? So that's kind of interesting. Emanuel Swedenborg believed that he was Jesus in the second coming, and started a church, of course, because, you know, the second coming has arrived. I'm here. And so, and he wrote a lot, and he has followers. It's one of the smallest churches in the United States. Still, obviously, this was in Europe, but he had followers that came here. And in fact, one of the main churches is in Bryn Athyn. And this is the church. It's a copy of one of the British churches. I forget which one. Oh, this is actually the main estate. This is the living room of the main house in Bryn Athyn. You can take a tour of the building, etc.
In your Oculus?
I haven't tried that, actually. No, I haven't. I've been there physically though, so.
I hear it's almost as good.
Which YouTube channel did I post it under? So this is inside the church. And there is the altar, which I don't know if you get to see it or not, but they made it to look like the Ark of the Covenant. So that's pretty cool. By the way, the picture I have of the Ten Commandments on the tablets with the Hebrew, that was from this tour as well. The big stained glass window, the main image on that is Swedenborg.
Is this through your Oculus?
Pardon?
Is this live or through your Oculus?
This is from that camera.
Oh,
I used that camera.
so you were there actually
I
physically,
was physically, yeah.
not virtually?
Well, it's just outside of Philadelphia. So.
Oh, okay.
So it was in between where we were staying and where my father-in-law was staying in the senior home that he was in before he died. So I don't know if you've ever visited paralyzed older people in homes like that, but it's very boring to stay there the whole day. So I would like go and do stuff. So, worked out pretty well. The lady there liked me and gave me about 15 free books.
I'm sure your wife loved that.
Doug, did
Question
you?
on Dewey. If I may.
Pardon?
Question on Dewey.
Sure.
Did he have any kind of life event occur, traumatic or anything? I'm trying to piece together his timeline. He has kind of a controversial segment of his getting involved with the education system, I would say, somewhat.
You mean with the
Owen and
president of the university?
Getting involved with Owens and Mann, Owens for mediating Mann, the communists, and taking on the
Oh, yeah.
Prussian education system.
He visited Russia?
His movement to collectivism, his interest in removing a lot of things from what I'm just trying to piece together things that I read about in the various contexts of his life and his different areas of interest. I'm wondering what actually was the key influence that moved him down certain directions towards the socialist communist view.
One of the big influences on him was Jane Addams
Okay.
in Chicago while he was there. She invited him to her house that she had set up for the poor. And John Dewey, I guess coming from Vermont, very, if you've ever been to the countryside there, no homeless there, right? And everybody enterprising, sound mind, religious, etc. Dewey was not especially religious, although he,
Opposite of that.
yeah, he
He rejected Christianity.
he was even told that it'd be pointless for him to go and get his PhD in philosophy unless he was also a minister, because no one would hire you unless you were a minister as well as a philosophy professor. And they were wrong, because for reasons that have nothing specific with Dewey, but the movement of the United States in general and higher education specifically was moving away from that kind of religious attachment.
Right.
Even the University of Virginia, the central building in that mall area was supposed to be normally the chapel. And what did Jefferson put there? The library, right? That's a message, right? But there's also if you look up Marsden. The Soul of the American University by George Marsden. The basic theme of this book is you start off with these are the beginnings of the university systems in the United States.
Marston's good.
And they're all basically there in order to raise ministers for the community so that they don't have to be imported from England. But gradually what happens is they become more and more secular. And then in fact we're now at the point where you have universities like UAA that doesn't even have a religion department. So you basically, you can take a few courses in religion. We have Jenny, can't think of her last name, sorry. She's our PhD in philosophy of religion, and there's another aspect, I haven't met her yet, so, but she teaches our religion courses, because Kristen Hansen retired. But,
I saw a couple boys on campus yesterday, and they were holding a sign, just sitting holding a big board that says Jesus loves you, and I wondered if this was part of a class or religious class that they were taking or something like that. And then there's some other people around campus that were holding like, what's your story sign or different types, so I wondered if it was something
they might not
similar.
have even been students, I don't know.
Yeah,
But they could have been, there are some clubs. There's
oh
the
yeah.
Newman Club on campus, which I think I'm still the official faculty member of, but there's, they never asked me for anything, so I don't know. I still get their emails though, but but who knows, we've had visitors from Texas that tried to get something going here. Hopefully it wasn't them, because we usually get warnings, beware the folks from that Baptist church,
Oh.
you know, are here, you know, et cetera. Beware. Well, but there were a lot of things in Dewey's life that were obviously traumatic. I know he was giving a lecture, and just prior to his giving the speech, he heard about the bombing in Pearl Harbor. That's got to be pretty traumatic, I would think. Every time he went to Europe with his family, one of his boys died. That's got to be always in Italy. So
Just from a social educational reform perspective, he was pretty fervent and just headstrong about transforming the United States education system, and he pretty much succeeded in doing it.
well, he was a Hegelian, and one of the things that Hegel's philosophy teaches us is that you have this dialectical process, which becomes a pragmatic problem. If you think of pragmatism as the natural successor to Hegelian philosophy, remember the existentialists kind of go off the deep end one side and the communists go off the deep end on the other. But pragmatism keeps both sides, even though there's this conflict between them, right? Because I am completely a free agent, and yet at the same time I'm a member of the spirit of the times, right? You know, so I've you know, how do I deal with that? But it's a dialectical process, and we have this ongoing back and forth between ideas and people and bacteria, you name it, right? That's life, you know, it's organic and it's dialectical, right? And conflict. And if you are going to teach people how to be survivors, right? To evolve, you know, and not be, you know, passed by everyone else, right? You've got to teach them to think. And sitting there and rote learning is not the way to develop people that can solve problems. What you have to do instead is transform education so that young people are going to have an opportunity to solve problems of more and more difficulty, right? And learn to use tools, working together in like a team effort, So Dewey created what was called the Laboratory School at the University of Chicago. It's basically to put Hegelian thinking into practice in educating young people. And I don't know if you've seen it, but might be the laboratory. Let's see if I can find the video. It's a fantastic video period piece. Let's see. That looks like it. This almost looks.
The small groups, and you really spend time talking with your peers and sort of creating ideas throughout there. And you know, in the real world and in life, that's something that's very important.
Labbies begin their journey at Earl Shapiro Hall, which houses the nursery, kindergarten, and primary schools, and then move to the historic campus, home to the lower, middle, and high schools. A lab education begins in nursery kindergarten, where students learn to play and play to learn, with the outdoors as a natural extension of the classroom.
The kids in one class decided that they were interested in castles and knights, and another class, and they were going over to the garden and they're getting their hands dirty.
In
Here it is.
To parent-teacher meetings goes many of the bewildered Olsen.
Now hold on, Miss Fox. It's all very well to teach my boy to paint pretty pictures and build birdhouses. He doesn't even know his multiplication table.
For generations, U.S. youngsters went to school because they had to. And most communities boasted but one room and a single teacher with which to educate their entire and assorted progeny.
Good morning, children. Good morning. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He made me to lie down in green pastures.
Johnny learned his multiplication tables as his father and grandfather had before him, through endless
Is this interesting?
drills.
I would have shown this in the second portion of the video.
By the same process, he learned the key dates of history and impossible to spell words. And geography. The drill formula was simple, if monotonous.
That used to be
And
called
Johnny's
the
marks
Board of
were more apt to
Education.
measure the strength of his memory than his understanding. Happiest moment for the school children of that sterner era was when school let out. But for some youngsters, staying after school seemed almost unavoidable. At Columbia University is one of the men responsible for the spread of today's revolutionary teaching ideas, Professor William Hurt Kilpatrick.
We are trying to help the child learn to face actuality. And on this basis, build his ideas, his character, has its virtues, but it also has its dangers.
That's
But
Johnny.
reassuring is the man more responsible than anyone else for the school's new teaching technique, America's #1 educator and philosopher, John Dewey.
The world is moving at a tremendous rate. No one knows where. We must prepare our children not for the world of the past, not for our world, but for their world, the world of the future.
So if you think of some of the changes, instead of having all age groups in one room, you end up with children in groups based on their age and development, right? And then the teacher's job is to not just have them memorizing things, but instead giving them problems aimed at their age level that they can solve by working together, right? So it requires a professional teacher who understands child psychology, so knows what each age group is capable of and what sort of problems they could be given that will help them gradually improve their problem-solving ability, etc. There were some debates between Dewey and Hutchins at the University of Chicago, and they're arguing back and forth over whether education should change or not, because Hutchins thought that what made a person educated was the great books. You got to read the great books, and he actually published them as a set, which I don't know if you remember going into Tidal Wave years ago when they were on Fireweed. They had a complete set of the great books, which were printed in a way that could not have been more boring. You know, they're each like all of Kant, in a narrow volume with small print and 2 columns, just absolutely the most boring way you could print text that way, because he was of the opinion that it's this hard work reading the text that's what makes a person educated. And Dewey, of course, was trying to transform education so that not only would you be familiar with some of the the classics and so on, but you would also be able to problem solve. You'd be a scientist as you come out of that. And Dewey became famous not only in the United States but internationally. He was visited by friends that Tolstoy had sent to ask him questions. But he went to China, he went to different places in Europe. He visited Russia. He was horrified at what he saw, and so his opinion of communism was radically changed. And when he came back, he was no longer a fan of communism as an idea. So I don't know if that's...
When was that trip? Do you know?
Offhand, no?
Probably the 40s? Early 40s, maybe? Well, that would have been, it would have been World War II.
Who reverses application?
Oh, I'm in videos. That's not going to help. Shoot.
I feel bad.
I have a couple of his biographies, not autobiographies,
1920s.
in 1928. Okay. Well, go back to Dewey when so I'm going in sequence right now, and so I think I mentioned. So William James, his father, remember, he was wealthy, was a member of the Swedenborg Church, by the way, and by the way, they are wealthy. I almost think of them as the kind of thing that, what's that church that all the wealthy go to in Scientology? So something weird.
Where you pay for your enlightenment levels?
Something like that. So Bryn Athyn, that church is fantastically expensive, and the college Bryn Athyn is also big, beautiful, ancient looking, but new. They copied buildings from Europe. Lots of art. They collect religious art from all over. So a lot of, if you get to visit the museum at Bryn Athyn, they have all sorts of Egyptian art, but not just Egyptian, all sorts of religious art, spiritual art from all over. So quite fascinating. But But the odd thing about William James's father is that he was a minister in that church. But he took his family to Europe, and they traveled all over. In fact, he would read up on schools that were considered to be the best schools for their children. And they would move to that community in Paris or wherever, enroll the children, and the children would start studying in that school. But after a couple of months, he was convinced that they weren't as good as they had been billed, and they would take them out and move to another school. So they kept school hopping all over Europe to try to get the kids the best education they could. And William James continued on taking college courses. He studied psychology in Germany. Okay.
Sounds horrible though, keep moving schools around, especially when you're not the one to, your kids. I don't know.
James wanted to be an artist. William James wanted to be an artist, but he ended up studying psychology and then philosophy. He began as an instructor in physiology at Harvard in 1872, but then became a professor of psychology and philosophy in 1880. And he had highly successful lectures at Columbia University and the University of Oxford. His one of his most famous books is the not The Source of Religious Insight, that's Royce. Oh, goodness gracious, I can't think of it. Actually, I'm sure I have it in my notes here. Let me just keep going. So the Principles of Psychology I mentioned, that was one of his most important books. That was 1890. Social Dialectic. This is within individuals as much as between individuals. That's just like Hegel, right? You know, you have this dialectical process going on between us, but it's also inside of us. It's at multiple levels simultaneously. And consciousness is nothing other than the subjective experience. Feeling may be likened to a this is a quote, feeling may be likened to a cross-section of the chain of nervous discharge, ascertaining the links already laid down and groping among the fresh ends presented to it for the one which seems to fit the case. And so the varieties of the religious experience, that's probably one of the most famous books. You probably have already heard of that one, in fact, I guess. Oddly, if you go to Barnes and Nobles down the street, you will find, it's further than down the street, we're not on main campus, but you know what I mean, Barnes and Nobles. I don't know why I say Barnes and Ig Nobles, that's just dumb. But in any case, you will find that book on their shelf new, and yet it's over 100 years old, 120 years old, and it's new on the shelf. And by the way, you don't have to even buy it, it's online, right? So you can, and it was in English, so you can find it, you know, it's not like it's a translation or anything. And that was his lecture that he gave at the Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh in 1901, 1902. And that was, so the Gifford lectures are lectures on the topic of philosophy and religion and science. So the religious in nature, right? A lot of the folks I've mentioned in my list for your term papers have also given lectures at the Gifford. They still have new Gifford lecturers every year, right? And James and Royce both were invited to go, one after the other. And so James's lectures were the varieties of the religious experience. Royce's were the sources of religious insight, which is also on the web, and you can You can read that, and that's absolutely gorgeous, by the way. So it's on religion, but he's not there to argue for a particular religious perspective. He's instead there to argue, in a sense, for the right to believe, the will to believe, right? So as a psychologist, he's there to argue how valuable the religious experience is and how good it is for human beings to have religion, because the most important aspect of this is the religious experience testifies that we can experience union with something larger than ourselves, and in that union find our greatest peace. Remember last week I also mentioned Dr. Newberg and his book, Why God Will Not Go Away, right? You know, the idea that each of us have a part of our brain that's basically waiting for the opportunity for us to meditate. When we meditate, we turn that part of the brain on and kind of shut all the others down, so that for a while at least we're one with the universe and we have infinite peace while we're in that meditative state. And that's what he's describing as the religious experience. And the reason there are varieties is he uses his library sources. He didn't actually physically go around the world and interview people. That would be, what's his name? William Smith, I think. Shoot, I forget his name too. Sorry, I'm getting old. I'm not remembering all my sources. But there was a guy he was born to parents who were Protestant ministers in China, missionaries, and he grew up there, but then lots of other places. But he ended up then studying all the world religions, and he's got some really beautiful books out on all the world religions, and they've done videos of these visits too. I don't know if you've seen him or not. Well, James doesn't do that. He's just researching all the religions in his library, and basically describes each of the main religious individual, like Jesus, Moses, Abraham, Muhammad, Buddha, those kinds of individuals, and comes to conclude that certain individuals have this religious experience. Practically everyone else does not. But they share that experience with everyone else, and for those that listen to them and then participate in practices associated with that, whatever religion they represent, ends up having a share of that kind of experience. Even though you don't actually have the full experience yourself, you can still kind of piggyback off of the ones who do.
Wait, so if I understand it, it's only those people in those kind of power religious positions that have that experience?
The full, yeah, the,
Okay.
so when you, I think, for example, of St. Francis of Assisi, if you think of him being totally transformed, he was ill, but while he was ill, he's totally transformed, and just, are you familiar with St. Francis of Assisi at all? I have resources here. This is, so this is the trailer of a movie.
He came from a place where wealth was sacred. He lived in a time when war was holy.
War's a serious business.
Yes, war is beautiful. And and to think people speak badly of war.
Go forth, sons of Assisi! God is with you!
And in his innocence, he made a world where only truth was sacred and only life was holy.
That's why all the statues had the birds and the rabbits.
His was the vision to see a higher beauty and to know a greater
He was
love.
the founder of the Franciscans.
People say you're mad. Do you know that? You sing like the birds. I think you're mad before. Not now.
Father, I want to share my joy with you. Our treasures are in heaven, Father, not here on earth. Don't be a slave to these. Throw it all away.
You understand that Holy Mother Church must punish those who subvert the established order. A man such as you is either criminal or someone seeking the light.
Father, I give you back everything that belongs to you. Your clothes, your possessions, your name too. His was the strength to build this world, and his was the courage to live in it.
If you want your dream to want your, take your time, your Savior gave your soul, beginning stronger and Father, great was filtering, fill your heaven's glory.
Now, Franco Zeffirelli has made his first film since Romeo and Juliet. A story of his time. and
Obi-Wan
our time.
Kenobi was the Pope.
A motion picture that unites us all.
In our obsession with original sin, we do often forget original innocence.
Brother sun, sister moon.
Interesting.
Yeah, he also went with the Crusaders to Saladin, and he was the one who intervened with Saladin and spent a couple days talking with him. So that's learning from them. And by the way, the prayer of Saint Francis that he brought back with him is actually a Muslim prayer, so that's kind of interesting. But he also experienced the stigmata. Yes, if you're familiar with that. So his meditative experiences were so strong that he ended up with the wounds that Jesus had, the stigmata, the sign of the nails in the hands and feet. So that kind of experience, I'm not familiar with any of his followers having the same kind of experience, but he has this religious experience, and his followers, including St. Clair, the young lady in the movie, that he cut her hair off because she decided to become a nun along, so she started an order as well. But as far as I know, no one else in his even close circle experienced the same kind of meditative experience, but they kind of piggyback on his experience, the strength of his experience. And that's, I think, what James is also pointing out in the book. but it's not worthless. You know, just because you yourself don't have that same experience, nonetheless, you can have a significant religious experience, even though it's not absolutely, you know, amazing, I guess, if that's, I suppose. But James is looking at all of this from the point of view of a psychologist that's talking about what's important to human beings. And so religion is an important part of our lives that we should not ignore, right? We should appreciate that. So John Dewey. I'm just following my notes here. So he was born in 1859, so obviously of all of them, he's the more recent of them. Dies in 1952, much later than the others.
Almost 100 years old.
He's old. Yeah, he's one of the ones that, you know, I have a list of who I'm trying to catch up to, you know, and he's one of them.
Yeah.
Bertrand Russell and him are, you know, up in there. But he was born in Burlington, Vermont. His BA degree was from the University of Vermont, 1879. He went with his older brothers and they all graduated together. So I guess that makes him slightly ahead, I suppose. He gets his PhD from Johns Hopkins in 1884. Then he goes to the University of Michigan, where he was in the faculty there from 84 to 88. And then he got a position teaching at the University of Minnesota for 1 year, but then the chair of the University of Michigan department died, and he was invited back to replace him as the chair. And he did that until 94. He went to the University of Chicago to 1904, and the problem there was that conflict with the president of the university, who had a disagreement over the nature of a good education. And so that conflict ended up with Dewey, while he was in China, the President Hutchins took his activity school and moved it from the philosophy department to the School of Education. So when Dewey got back, he was no longer in charge of it. And so Dewey left the university and ended up going to Columbia University in New York, where he stayed until he retired. But Jane Addams was the one that was pretty significant for him. What was the name of the house not Adam's house, but something else? What was it?
Hull House.
Hull?
H-U-L-L House.
Hull House. Oh, there it
I
is.
just read it.
Yeah. I don't know if it's still there at all, but her thinking was that by improving the education of the poor, you could help them out of poverty. And so this was a house that was not just like a place for them to come and have coffee and some help, but it was also like a museum. So there was art there that they could see and appreciate and things of that sort. And Dewey and Jane became friends. And so he came to visit there, and he was absolutely astounded by the nature of poverty and homelessness. He had never seen it before, and so that was a real shock to him. She won an award, by the way, the Nobel Peace Prize, 1931. It seems to me that the president also awarded her something. I should know a lot more about her than I do. Okay. So he retired in 1931, but he continued to lecture and write all over the place. So instrumentalism, what he called his philosophy was truth, is an instrument used by us to solve our problems. It changes as the problems change. So it has no eternal or transcendental reality. And here's an interesting problem for pragmatism. And you might apply this is certainly a Hegelian issue as well. If we're looking at the evolution of our human consciousness, right? Say, for example, slavery. Jefferson was certainly faced with the problem of slavery. There's lots of discussion about how he dealt with that, because of course on the one hand he's the one that writes all men are created equal. That's pretty famous, right? We all know that. But at the same time he owned his own slaves, and in fact when he died he did not release very many. I don't think he released any of them actually. So that was like the wealth that he was passing on to his children. And one of the ones was his cousin. She was a slave, but nonetheless she was his cousin. And not only was she his cousin, and she was his cousin because his uncle had relations with one of his female slaves, and she was one of the children from that relationship. And then when that uncle died, Jefferson inherited her, right? So she's actually a cousin, right? And when she was a young girl, she went with him to Paris when he was the diplomat from, along with Ben Franklin, to try to get the French on our side during the Revolutionary War. And by the time they came back, she and he had children. So not only was she his slave, but she was also, once his wife had died before that, she ended up his wife, basically, right? He couldn't marry her because he had promised his wife before she died that he wouldn't marry because she didn't want any of her children to have a stepmother. So instead, he's basically living with his slave. And we know now from DNA studies that he had more children from, he has more ancestors from her